The frost came first. It always did on February mornings in the Walmart parking lot, creeping across the Honda Civic's windows like ivy claiming abandoned walls. Margot Whitmore woke at 5:30 to the familiar ache in her lower back, the one that counted each uncomfortable night with the precision of a debt collector. 207. 7 months of sleeping in a driver's seat while her 9-year-old daughter curled under winter coats in the back juniper June to everyone who mattered, breathing soft and steady in the kind of peace that broke a mother's heart every dawn. The parking lot stretched empty and gray under sodium lights that never quite died, just faded into the coming day like promises no one intended to keep. Delivery trucks idled near the loading bay, their engines a low rumble that Margot had learned to find comforting. At least the noise meant other people existed, even if none of them saw a middle-aged art teacher and her daughter as anything more than early shoppers when the doors opened at 6. Margot turned carefully, her body protesting the movement. June slept with her face pressed against the window, her breath creating small circles of condensation that appeared and vanished in rhythm with her dreams. The girl had adapted to this life with a resilience that felt both miraculous and profoundly wrong. No child should know how to fold winter coats into bedding with hospital corners. No child should wake each morning and immediately scan the parking lot to see if anyone had noticed them, if today would be the day someone called the authorities about a woman who couldn't provide her daughter with 4 walls and a roof that didn't leak motor oil. The phone in the cup holder read 5:32, 28 minutes until the store opened and they could move into the restroom, wash their faces in the sink, brush their teeth over drains that smelled of industrial cleaner, and 1,000 other people's desperation. Margot reached for her wallet, counting bills she already knew by denomination and serial number. $23.47. The math wrote itself in her head without permission. 12 for gas to get to Henderson High and back for 3 days, assuming the Honda's appetite for fuel didn't increase. That left $11.47 for food. Peanut butter sandwiches. Maybe apples, if the markdown bin offered mercy. The phone buzzed. Unknown number. Margot's hand hovered over it, every instinct screaming to let it go to voicemail. Unknown numbers at this hour meant bill collectors or bad news, and she'd learned that bad news didn't improve with waiting. It just festered, grew teeth, became the kind of thing that woke you at 3 in the morning with your heart hammering against ribs that felt too thin to contain it. She answered. The voice on the other end carried the professionally gentle tone that lawyers practiced in front of mirrors, the kind of inflection designed to cushion blows that would land regardless of how softly they were delivered. Frederick Patterson from Patterson and Associates. Her grandmother, Margaret Whitmore, had passed away 3 days ago. The funeral had been yesterday afternoon at Riverside Memorial, which Margot had missed because $37 in her checking account didn't stretch to cover the 70-mile round trip from the suburb where she taught to the cemetery in Denver. The will would be read Monday morning at 10 o'clock. Patterson's voice carried something underneath the professional sympathy a current Margot couldn't quite name. Anticipation, maybe, or warning. Margot lowered the phone and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, fighting the sob that threatened to crack her chest open and spill 7 months of accumulated grief across the dashboard. Margaret had been the only one. The only family member who'd called after Ryan filed for divorce, and the lawyer explained that teaching art to teenagers for $37,000 a year meant Margot couldn't fight for the house, couldn't afford to keep the life they'd built in the suburb with the good schools and the farmer's market on Saturdays. The only one who hadn't said variations of "I told you so" when Margot finally admitted, voice small and ashamed over a payphone outside a gas station, that she and June were sleeping in the Honda. And Margot hadn't seen her in 8 months. 8 months because gas cost money and pride cost more, because showing up at Margaret's door would mean admitting just how far she'd fallen, how completely she'd failed at the basic adult task of keeping a roof over her child's head. Movement in the back seat. June sat up slowly, her voice cutting through the pre-dawn darkness with the terrible perceptiveness that children of crisis develop too young. "Is it Grandma Margaret?" Margot turned, wiping her eyes before her daughter could catalog the tears and add them to the weight she already carried. But June was already reading her mother's face the way some people read weather looking for storms. "The funeral was yesterday, baby. I'm sorry. I didn't know." June's chin trembled. Then she pressed her lips together, swallowing the grief so her mother wouldn't crack. 9 years old and already fluent in the art of protecting parents from their own failures. Margot wanted to scream at the universe for teaching her daughter this particular skill, this awful competence. "There's a will reading on Monday. The lawyer says Grandma left specific instructions." Hope flickered in June's eyes, dangerous and sharp. Margot knew what her daughter was thinking, because she was thinking it too. Had been thinking it since Patterson's voice carried that strange undertone through the phone line. Maybe enough for an apartment deposit. Maybe enough for first and last month's rent. Maybe enough to stop pretending this was an adventure, to stop watching June lie to her friends about why they could never come over, why sleepovers only happened at other people's houses. "We should get ready for school. Early bird catches the worm, right?" June nodded and started folding the coats with practiced efficiency. They had a routine now, 7 months of repetition, turning survival into muscle memory. Margot would walk June to the Walmart bathroom where they'd wash up in sinks that automated faucets made complicated brush teeth while avoiding eye contact with women who weren't living in their cars, change clothes from plastic bins in the trunk that held everything they owned, that mattered. Today was a protein bar day. McDonald's dollar menu breakfast required money they didn't have. The memory hit without warning, sharp enough to steal breath. 6 months ago. Not even 6 months. Sterling's voice on the phone when Margot had finally broken down and called her brother for help, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold the phone. "You made your choices, Margot. Teaching art to teenagers doesn't pay bills. I can't enable poor life decisions." She'd asked for $2,000, enough for an apartment deposit in a neighborhood that wasn't great but wasn't dangerous enough for 1 month's rent, so June could have a bedroom and a door that locked and a place to invite friends without shame. Sterling drove a Tesla Model X and owned a penthouse downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. His fintech company had been valued at $50 million in the last funding round, but Margot's request for enough money to stop sleeping in parking lots constituted enabling poor decisions. The gym opened at 5:30 on weekdays. Margot had maintained her $29 membership for one reason only, and it wasn't fitness. The showers ran hot and didn't cut off after 5 minutes, and the locker room offered privacy that Walmart restrooms couldn't match. They arrived at 5:45, Margot carrying their backpack with clean clothes and towels that had seen better days, June holding her school uniform in a careful bundle that wouldn't wrinkle. The teenager at the front desk barely looked up from her phone. Margot and June headed straight for the women's locker room, moving with the confidence of people who belonged, who were just getting in an early morning workout before school and work, and all the normal rhythms of lives that included addresses and mailboxes and utility bills. Margot stood under the spray and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something approaching luxury, feeling the heat work into shoulders that hadn't fully relaxed in 7 months. The water ran over her face, and she pretended just for those 30 seconds that this was her bathroom in a home she owned, that June was getting ready in her own room down a hallway with family photos on the walls, that life was something other than an endless calculation of dollars against days. When they emerged, June looked like any other fourth grader heading to St. Catherine's Elementary. Navy jumper, white polo shirt, hair in neat braids that Margot had learned to do by flashlight in the Honda's rearview mirror. The uniform was 2 years old and the hem had been let out twice, but it was clean. Whatever else fell apart, June's uniform stayed pristine. That mattered even if Margot couldn't articulate exactly why. Her own clothes came from Target clearance racks 3 years ago, wearing thin at the knees and elbows but professional enough for teaching. She'd learned to tie scarves in ways that disguised the fraying collar of her one good blouse. Art teacher chic, she used to joke in better days. Now it was just camouflage armor against the questions she couldn't answer honestly. They drove in silence to St. Catherine's, the morning routine swallowing words that might crack if spoken aloud. Margot pulled up to the early drop-off program, and June gathered her backpack, then turned and hugged her mother with an intensity that pressed bruises into Margot's ribs. "I love you, Mom. Love you more, baby." Then June was gone, disappearing into the building where she would spend the next 8 hours pretending her life was normal, that she went home to a house with a kitchen and a bed and all the ordinary infrastructure of childhood. Margot drove across town to Henderson High, parking in the teacher's lot among Hondas and Toyotas that were newer than hers, that didn't have check engine lights glowing like accusatory eyes. She walked through the morning chill with her lesson plans, and her grandmother's death sitting heavy in her chest, both equally impossible to process. The break room coffee was burnt and bitter, but it was free. Sarah from English asked if Margot was okay, mentioned she looked tired. Allergies. Margot lied and escaped to her classroom where she could be alone with thoughts that spiraled like water down a drain. Her students filed in at 7:50. 23 juniors ranging from genuinely interested in perspective drawing to deeply asleep with their eyes open. Margot launched into her lesson on value scales, demonstrating shading techniques, while her mind wandered to Monday morning, to Patterson's professionally gentle voice, to the wild and desperate hope that maybe Margaret had left something that would change their lives. The weekend passed in the particular purgatory of having nowhere to go and nothing to do except exist. They spent Saturday at the library, June doing homework while Margot stared at job listings she couldn't apply for because every position that paid more than teaching required an address for background checks. Sunday they drove to a park, and Margot pushed June on swings that squeaked with each arc, watching her daughter laugh with a freedom that only appeared when they weren't confined to the Honda's interior. Sunday night, Margot cashed her bi-weekly paycheck at a check-cashing place that took 3% but didn't require a bank account she couldn't maintain. $2,180 direct deposit. She watched $900 disappear to the storage unit where everything they owned that didn't fit in the car sat in a 10x10 space. $420 to car insurance. $250 to minimum payments on credit cards she'd maxed out during the divorce back when she still believed things would get better. That left $610 for the entire month. Gas, food, June's lunch money, phone bill, gym membership, and the constant terrifying knowledge that one car repair would destroy them completely. She pulled $120 for Monday's trip. Gas to Denver and back with enough margin for error if they hit traffic or the Honda's consumption increased. The remaining $490 had to last 28 days. $1,750 per day for everything. The math was simple and brutal and entirely inflexible. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable cold. Margot woke at 4:30, unable to sleep, her mind churning through possibilities and probabilities with the obsessive detail of someone who'd learned that hope was dangerous but impossible to extinguish completely. She and June ate protein bars in the darkness, dressed in their best clothes, because Patterson and Associates occupied the kind of building where appearance mattered. Margot wore her one funeral-appropriate dress, black and plain and 3 years out of style. June wore her school uniform because it was the nicest thing she owned, the only outfit without visible wear at the seams. They drove to Denver through early morning traffic, the Honda's check engine light casting an orange glow across the dashboard. Margot found herself praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Just get us there. Just hold together until we know what's waiting. After that, you can fall apart and I'll find a way to deal with it, but please just give me this one thing." The law office occupied the 8th floor of a building downtown that screamed money in every brass fixture and polished marble tile. Margot and June rode the elevator in silence, both dressed in their best, both acutely aware that their best wasn't good enough for a place like this. The receptionist directed them to a conference room that could have held Margot's entire classroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Denver's skyline mountains, visible in the distance like promises of escape. The conference table probably cost more than Margot made in a year, polished to a shine that reflected the morning light. Frederick Patterson was already there, arranging papers with the careful precision of someone who'd delivered life-altering news too many times to be moved by the grief it caused. He looked up as Margot entered, and something in his eyes softened. "Miss Whitmore, thank you for coming. Please sit." Margot and June took seats on one side of the massive table. Patterson poured water from a crystal pitcher into glasses that probably cost $50 each. Margot's mouth was desert dry, but she couldn't bring herself to drink. Not yet. Not until she knew. "Are we waiting for Sterling and Sloan?" "They should be here shortly. Can I get you anything?" "Coffee. There are pastries in the break room." "We're fine, thank you." June's hand found Margot's under the table, small fingers squeezing tight. Margot squeezed back and tried to project confidence she absolutely did not feel. The door opened at 10:05. Sterling arrived first, phone pressed to his ear, barely acknowledging Margot's presence. He was dressed for this, the way he dressed for board meetings. Tom Ford suit that probably cost $3,000, Apple Watch Ultra, catching light with each gesture hair styled in that effortlessly expensive way that required $200 of monthly maintenance. He ended his call and dropped into a chair across from Margot, without greeting her, just a quick glance and then back to his phone. She could see the Tesla app open, could watch him checking something about his car from 8 floors up, while their grandmother's will waited to be read. Sloan swept in at 10:10, bringing the scent of expensive perfume and the energy of someone who billed by the quarter hour. Maserati keys in hand, Hermes briefcase that Margot recognized from a magazine article about Sloan making partner at Crawford and Associates. She'd worn a Cartier watch to Margaret's funeral. Margot remembered because she'd stared at it during the brief phone call where Sloan had mentioned the service was happening but hadn't actually extended an invitation. Sloan's eyes swept over Margot and June with an assessment that took approximately 1 second. Target dress-worn shoes, the unmistakable markers of struggle. Something flickered in her expression that might have been pity or might have been satisfaction. Either way, it made Margot's skin crawl. "Shall we begin?" Patterson's voice carried the gentle firmness of someone trying to keep this professional, trying to prevent the room from exploding into the kind of family drama that turned estate proceedings into blood sport. Sterling set his phone face down on the table with the reverence most people reserved for religious artifacts. Sloan opened a leather notepad and clicked a pen that probably cost more than Margot's grocery budget. Both of them looked at Patterson with the focused attention of people waiting to learn how much richer they were about to become. Patterson cleared his throat and began reading in the flat legal tone that made even death sound like a contract negotiation. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, had executed her will on March 3rd of the previous year. There were small bequests to various charities: $15,000 to the Denver Art Initiative, $5,000 to the Copperfield Public Library, another $10,000 split between the local food bank and women's shelter. Sterling shifted impatiently. Sloan made a note. Margot felt June press closer against her side. "To my grandson, Sterling Whitmore, I leave the property located at 2847 Cherry Hills Drive, including all structures, furnishings, and landscaping." Sterling nodded. Margot knew that address. Lakefront house probably worth $1.4 million at current market rates. Sterling's expression didn't change. He'd expected this. To my granddaughter Sloane Ashford, I leave my complete collection of antique jade pieces professionally appraised at $950,000, as well as my vintage jewelry collection appraised at $180,000. Sloane made another note. Efficient, clinical, like she was tallying up a business deal rather than receiving her grandmother's estate. Patterson paused. His eyes found Margot's with something that looked like apology. To my granddaughter, Margot Whitmore, I leave the sum of $5 in cash and the original mountain homestead located at Copper Ridge, Colorado. GPS coordinates and property deed to be provided separately. The silence that followed had weight and shape. It pressed down on the room like a physical thing, crushing the air from Margot's lungs until breathing became a conscious effort. Then Sterling laughed. It wasn't a chuckle or a quiet expression of disbelief. It was a full, genuine laugh that echoed off the conference room walls and seemed to go on forever, each new wave of it landing on Margot like stones thrown at close range. His head tilted back. His shoulders shook. The sound of it made her vision narrow to pinpoints. $5. 5. That's it. He could barely get the words out through the laughter, each syllable fractured by the kind of mirth that comes from witnessing someone else's humiliation. Sloane wasn't laughing, but her lips had curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like satisfaction at being proven right about something she'd suspected all along. The old mountain shack. Father, that place hasn't been occupied in 40 years. The structure is probably condemned by now. Sterling was still laughing, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Margot, I'm sorry, but this is almost funny. $5. I spend more than that on coffee. Sloane's voice cut through with surgical precision, though perhaps proportional to life contributions. Sterling built a $50 million company. I made partner at Crawford. You draw pictures with teenagers for $37,000 a year. The words landed like physical blows. Margot's hands clenched under the table, but she kept her face still. 7 months of sleeping in a car had taught her how to take hits without flinching, how to let cruelty wash over her without giving anyone the satisfaction of a visible reaction. June's hand squeezed harder. Margot squeezed back. We're okay, the pressure said. We've survived worse than this. Patterson cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitmore left specific instructions regarding the mountain property. She requested that Margot visit the site personally before making any decisions about disposition. Disposition means getting rid of it, in case legal terminology is unfamiliar. Sloane delivered the translation with the condescending patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. What's to decide? The place is worthless, not even worth the property taxes. You'd have to pay to keep it. Sterling leaned back in his chair, still grinning. Actually, the property taxes are current and paid through the end of the year, and there are no liens or encumbrances. The 40 acres are fully yours, Miss Whitmore. Patterson's voice carried a hint of steel that Margot appreciated even through the fog of humiliation. 40 acres of rocks and a collapsing cabin. Congratulations, little sister. You're officially a slum lord. Sloane gathered her papers with efficient movements, preparing to leave to return to her important life and expensive car, and the comfortable knowledge that she'd gotten what she deserved, what she'd earned through building empires and making partner, and not wasting time teaching art to ungrateful teenagers. At the door, Sterling paused and turned back. His grin had faded into something that might have been genuine concern if Margot hadn't known him better, hadn't spent 37 years watching him perform empathy without ever quite feeling it. Seriously, Margot, call me when you're ready to dump it. I'll make sure you get at least enough to cover the hassle. Then they were gone. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid, like the final punctuation on a sentence that had already said everything it needed to say about family and worth and the ways people measured value. Margot sat in the sudden silence, staring at her hands folded on the table, breathing carefully through the rage and humiliation and the small, stupid part of her that had hoped for something different. Patterson pushed a thick manila envelope across the table. Inside, you'll find the property deed, GPS coordinates, keys to the structure, and a personal letter from your grandmother. Margot took the envelope with numb fingers. It was heavier than she'd expected, substantial in a way that seemed to contradict the $5 inheritance. I should tell you, your grandmother spoke very highly of you in our meetings. Very highly. She was quite clear that you were to receive the mountain property specifically because, and I quote, Margot will understand when the time is right. What's there to understand? The words came out harder than Margot intended, sharpened by humiliation and exhaustion. It's a worthless shack. My siblings are right to laugh. Patterson studied her for a long moment, his professional mask slipping just enough to reveal something human underneath. Your grandmother was many things, Miss Whitmore, but she wasn't cruel and she wasn't foolish. If she left you this property, she had reasons. He stood and gathered his papers. Take your time. The room is yours for as long as you need. When he left, Margot finally let herself feel it. Not tears. She'd run out of those somewhere around month 3 of sleeping in her car. Just a hollow ache that started in her chest and spread outward until her entire body felt empty, scooped clean of everything except the persistent, stubborn refusal to break completely. June shifted in her seat. Mom, I know, baby. Uncle Sterling was mean. He was. And Aunt Sloane, too. Yeah, she was. June pulled the manila envelope closer and opened it carefully, the way she did everything now, with a precision born from living in spaces too small for carelessness. Inside was a smaller box, aged leather with tarnished brass clasps. She opened it and gasped. Mom, look. Margaret's jade bracelet. The one Margot had admired every time she'd visited her grandmother, the simple band of green stone worn smooth by decades of wear. The one Sloane had probably assumed would be part of her jade collection, probably already had a display case picked out for in her downtown condo. Margot lifted it out with shaking hands. Inside the band, engraved in delicate script, To Margaret, for keeping promises, 1967. Grandma knew. She knew what we'd need. June's voice carried certainty that Margot couldn't quite reach, not yet. Not while the laughter still echoed in her ears. That night, Margot sat in the driver's seat of the Honda, while June slept in the back, and finally opened the letter Patterson had mentioned. Margaret's handwriting covered 3 pages in the careful script of someone who'd taken her time, who'd known these words needed to last beyond her lifetime. My dearest Margot, it began. They laughed, didn't they? Margot pressed her hand to her mouth, vision blurring. Sterling and Sloane. I knew they would. That's why I'm trusting you, not them. The mountain property isn't what it seems. Your great-great-grandmother, Anna Blackwater, built that homestead in 1867. She was half Irish, half Ute, rejected by both worlds. But she survived. She thrived. And she hid something there. Something I've protected for 70 years, waiting for the right person. Not the richest person. Not the most successful. The right person. You, Margot. You've been tested by life in ways they never have. Homeless, divorced, broke. But you still protect June's joy. Still teach beauty to ungrateful teenagers. Still believe in goodness. That's rare. That's strong. Go to the cabin, northeast corner, loose floorboard. Look for the trapdoor. Combination is 1867. The year Anna built her home. What's below will change everything. But Margot, listen carefully. How you use it will define who you are. This isn't just money. It's a 159-year promise Anna made. I've kept it. Now I'm passing it to you. Trust yourself. You survived homelessness with grace. You can handle this. I love you. I've always been proudest of you. At the bottom of the envelope, wrapped in tissue paper, was a pocket watch, gold, heavy, ornate. Margot turned it over and found an inscription, "To Anna. Time reveals all truths. 1867." The watch still ticked perfect rhythm, keeping time after more than a century and a half. Margot held it to her ear and listened to the steady beat. And for the first time in 7 months, she let herself imagine that maybe tomorrow would be different from today. But then her phone buzzed. One bar of signal flickering through the parking lot's scattered coverage. A text from Sterling, lawsuit filed. Hearing scheduled Monday, March 9th, 9 a.m. Contesting grandmother's mental capacity. You have 1 week. Use it wisely. Margot stared at the screen until the words blurred. 1 week. 7 days to find whatever Margaret had hidden, to understand what Anna Blackwater had protected for 51 years, to prove that the cabin was worth more than $5, and the laughter of siblings who measured everything in money. She turned the phone face down and looked at the pocket watch still ticking in her palm. Time reveals all truths. Tomorrow they would drive to Copper Ridge. Tomorrow they would find out if Margaret's faith was justified, or just the confused hope of a dying woman trying to make meaning from worthless inheritance. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of exhaustion that lives in bone marrow. Margot had taught Tuesday through Thursday on autopilot, her mind elsewhere even as she demonstrated shading techniques and talked about negative space. The students noticed she was distracted but didn't comment, probably grateful their art teacher wasn't paying enough attention to assign homework. She'd spent lunch periods in her classroom researching Colorado property law on her phone, trying to understand what Sterling's lawsuit could actually accomplish, what rights she had to property that was legally hers, but might not stay that way. She deposited her paycheck and watched the money vanish into obligations before it even felt real. $900 to storage, $420 to insurance, $250 to credit cards that would never be paid off at this rate. The remaining $610 had to stretch across 30 days like taffy pulled too thin. She allowed herself $120 for the trip to Copper Ridge. Gas, food, basic camping supplies. If Margaret's letter proved true, and there really was something worth finding under a cabin floor. If the trapdoor existed at all and wasn't just the confused last wish of a dying woman trying to make meaning from a property that had always been worthless. Walmart again, but this time walking through the aisles as a customer rather than someone sleeping in the parking lot. 2 heavy-duty flashlights rated for cave exploration. Climbing rope with a 500-pound capacity. Batteries in bulk packaging. First aid kit because mountain cabins and trapdoors suggested the possibility of injury. Matches, emergency blankets, food that wouldn't spoil. Peanut butter bread, apples, granola bars, bottled water. The total came to $99.34. Margot stared at the receipt and did the mental math that had become second nature. $490 left for 28 days, $17.50 per day for everything else. The Honda's check engine light glowed like a prophecy of mechanical failure she couldn't afford. June watched her mother calculate and didn't ask the question hovering between them like smoke. What happens if there's nothing under the cabin? What happens if Grandma Margaret was confused at the end and there's no trapdoor? No hidden treasure, just 40 acres of Colorado mountainside, and a structure so run down it wasn't worth the $5 she'd left in cash alongside it. They loaded supplies into the trunk, cramming them between plastic bins that held their entire existence. June's clothes, Margot's clothes, books, art supplies. The few photographs Margot had grabbed when Ryan changed the locks and made it clear she had 30 minutes to collect personal items before he called the police. Everything that mattered reduced to what fit in a 15-year-old SUV with a failing transmission. The drive took 3 hours through late February cold that made the heater's intermittent function feel like deliberate cruelty. They left Denver's sprawl behind and climbed into mountains that still held snow in shadowed places where sunlight never quite penetrated. The heater blasted hot air for 10 minutes, then gave up entirely, a pattern Margot had learned to work around by layering coats. June did homework by the dome light, practicing long division in a notebook balanced on her knees. She asked about irregular verbs and state capitals and whether butterflies could fly in the rain. Normal questions that a 9-year-old should ask her mother on a road trip, not the questions Margot heard underneath them. Will we have a place to live after this? Will things get better? Are we going to be okay? The Honda's check engine light had company now. The low tire pressure warning appeared somewhere past Fairplay, a town that felt misnamed given their circumstances. Margot watched both lights glow and added them to the list of problems she couldn't solve with what remained in her checking account. The car struggled on steep grades, engine whining like an animal in pain. Margot pressed the accelerator and prayed to whatever might be listening. Just get us there. Hold together until we see what's waiting. You can die after that and I'll figure something out, but please just give me this one thing. They filled the silence by pretending this was a normal mother-daughter trip and not a desperate expedition to find meaning in an inheritance that had been designed to humiliate. June asked why Uncle Sterling didn't like them, her voice small in the way that meant she'd been thinking about it for days. Margot tried to explain that it wasn't about not liking that people who counted worth in dollars couldn't understand people who counted it in moments and connections and the ability to see beauty in charcoal drawings made by 15-year-olds who'd never held a pencil with intent before. But he thinks we're poor. Margot's hands tightened on the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. We're going through a tough time. That's different from poor. Poor is permanent. This is temporary. She didn't know if she believed it. 7 months was starting to feel pretty permanent, starting to feel like the new normal rather than a crisis with an expiration date. Are we poor, Mom? The question hung in the cold air between them, demanding honesty. Margot wasn't sure she had the strength to give. We don't have a home right now. We live in our car. That's poverty by most people's definition. But baby, you need to understand something. We have each other. We have food every day. You go to a good school. I have a job. We're struggling, but we're not poor in the ways that really matter. June was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the seriousness she brought to everything now. And we have Grandma's mountain. Something cracked in Margot's chest, hairline fractures spreading through foundations she'd thought were solid. Yes, we have that. The turnoff appeared just as the GPS died signal lost to mountain terrain that didn't care about human navigation needs. Margot pulled over and consulted the paper map from Margaret's envelope, finding a narrow dirt road marked by a faded wooden post she would have missed if she hadn't been looking for it. The sign read, Copper Ridge Trail 4-wheel drive, recommended in letters that had been painted decades ago and never refreshed. Margot looked at her 2-wheel drive Honda with its check engine light and worn tires and made a choice. They'd come this far. The car would either make it or it wouldn't, and worrying about mechanical failure before it happened was a luxury she couldn't afford. The dirt road was worse than expected. Deep ruts carved by runoff that had frozen and thawed and frozen again. Rocks that scraped the undercarriage with sounds that made Margot wince. Branches whipped against the windows like fingers trying to pry them open. The Honda bounced and struggled and somehow kept going, climbing steadily higher through trees that pressed close enough to block most of the afternoon light. 15 minutes of teeth-rattling progress. Then the road opened into a clearing and Margot's foot hit the brake hard enough that June lurched forward against her seatbelt. The cabin sat 50 feet ahead, caught in the dying light of late afternoon sun. It was smaller than Margot had imagined from Margaret's letter, maybe 20 feet square at most. Built from logs that had weathered to silver gray, the color of bones left too long in the elements. The roof sagged on the left side, several shingles missing to create gaps like missing teeth in an old man's smile. The front porch had partially collapsed, one corner touching the ground at an angle that suggested complete structural failure wasn't far off. But it was the setting that stole Margot's breath and held it hostage. The cabin had been built directly against a cliff-face granite wall, rising 100 feet straight up to create a natural barrier that made the property feel both protected and trapped. Pine trees surrounded the clearing, their branches heavy with old snow that hadn't seen direct sunlight in weeks. In the fading light, shadows pooled between the trunks like dark water waiting to flood the clearing. "It's like a witch's house." June's whisper carried equal parts fear and wonder. But a good witch, like Grandma, was good. Margot parked 20 feet from the cabin and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was profound, the kind of quiet that exists only in places humans have mostly forgotten. No traffic sounds, no city hum, just wind through pine branches and the settling sounds of the Honda's engine cooling. They sat without moving, staring at the structure that represented either their salvation or the final confirmation that they were alone in the world with nothing and no one to catch them if they fell further than they'd already fallen. "We'll sleep in the car tonight. In the morning we'll see what's inside." June nodded and began the familiar routine of arranging coats for blankets, transforming the back seat into something approximating a bed through 7 months of practice. Margot reclined her seat and stared through the windshield at the cabin's dark shape against the darker cliff. Somewhere in Denver, Sterling was probably in his penthouse drinking scotch that cost more per bottle than Margot made in a week, confident that next Monday's hearing would overturn Margaret's crazy will and divide the property properly among people who actually deserved it. Sloane was probably in her Maserati driving to some event where she'd network with other people who measured success in billable hours and corner offices. And Margot was here in a car that might not start tomorrow morning with her 9-year-old daughter and a letter from a dead grandmother who'd promised that everything would change. The cabin's windows were dark and empty glass long gone to leave rectangular holes that looked like closed eyes. The door hung crooked on its hinges, partly open to reveal nothing but shadow and the smell of decades-old decay. Margot closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept returning to Margaret's words. Northeast corner, loose floorboard, trap door, combination 1867. What's below will change everything. June's breathing deepened into sleep. Margot lay awake watching stars appear through breaks in the clouds, listening to wind in the pines that sounded almost like voices if she let her imagination run. And somewhere around midnight she heard it. Glass breaking, or maybe a branch falling, or maybe nothing at all. Just the sound of an old structure continuing its slow collapse into the earth that would eventually reclaim it. Or maybe someone else knew about this place. Maybe Margaret had told someone before she died. Maybe they weren't as alone here as Margot had hoped. She sat up slowly, peering through the windshield at the cabin. Nothing moved. No lights, no shadows shifting where they shouldn't. Just an abandoned structure settling into ruin the way abandoned structures do. Probably nothing. Margot lay back down and pulled her coat tighter and told herself that tomorrow everything would be different. Tomorrow they'd find what Anna Blackwater had hidden 159 years ago. Tomorrow their lives would change. She almost believed it. Morning came cold and bright frost painting fern patterns across the Honda's windows to turn the world outside into crystalline blur. Margot woke to June already sitting up staring at the cabin through the passenger window with an intensity that suggested she'd been watching for a while. "How long have you been awake a while? What are you listening for? To see if it talks?" Margot almost smiled despite everything. "Houses don't talk, baby. Grandma's house did. You said so. You said old houses tell stories if you know how to listen." The memory surfaced unbidden. Margot at June's age, sitting in Margaret's kitchen while her grandmother explained how wood grain held time, how foundation cracks mapped decades, How every house whispered its history to those patient enough to hear. Sterling had called it hippie nonsense. Sloane had rolled her eyes and gone back to her law books. But Margot had listened and learned and carried that lesson into her teaching, into the way she helped teenagers understand that art wasn't about making pretty pictures, but about paying attention to what the world was trying to say. Let's go hear what this one has to say. They approached the cabin with the caution of people who'd learned that structures could betray you, that what looked solid might crumble under weight. Margot tested each porch board before committing her full mass to it. The wood groaned but held. 3 of the boards were soft, with rot flexing under pressure in ways that made her stomach clench. She marked them mentally and stepped over, guiding June to do the same. The door required force swollen from weather and time. It scraped against the frame with a sound like fingernails on wood protesting this intrusion into its long abandonment. The hinges shrieked metal against metal. Then they were inside. The smell hit first. Decades of dust thick enough to coat the back of Margot's throat. Mouse droppings in corners where rodents had made homes in the ruins. Old wood releasing the faint tang of resin that had crystallized over generations. Underneath it all, something else. Something mineral and cold that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves, from whatever waited beneath. One room. 20 feet by 20 feet, maybe less. A pot-bellied stove squatted in the far corner, rust eating through cast iron that had once kept Anna Blackwater warm through mountain winters. A table leaned against the wall, one leg snapped clean through at some point in the last few decades. Shelves lined the eastern side, empty except for tin cups that had oxidized to tarnished green. An alcove extended to the north, just large enough for sleeping. Light filtered through gaps in the roof, creating columns of illuminated dust that moved with their breathing, proof that they were disturbing air that had been still for years. Every surface wore a gray film, undisturbed except where their feet now left prints in patterns that would outlast their visit. Margot ran her finger across the table's surface, leaving a trail through decades of accumulation. Someone lived here. June moved through the space like a detective studying a crime scene, examining everything with careful attention. Made this home. She stopped near the alcove, crouched down. Mom, look. The dust told its own story. Near the door where weather had found entry, the coating was thicker, built up through seasons of rain and snow and wind. But in the protected corner of the alcove, the layer was thinner, filtered by distance from the elements. And in one spot, no dust at all. Just clean wood, as if something had rested there recently and been removed. Someone was here. Not long ago. June's voice carried certainty that made the hair on Margot's neck stand up. A rectangular outline in the dust, maybe a foot long, 6 inches wide. Something box-shaped had sat there, protected from the elements until recently removed, or taken. Maybe Grandma. Margot knelt beside her daughter, studying the pattern, trying to find innocent explanations that wouldn't lodge in her chest like splinters. Or someone took it. Someone who knew to look. June's eyes widened with fear that Margot immediately regretted putting there. Let's see what else we can find. The walls were solid despite their age, the timbers fitted with a precision that spoke of skill rather than desperation. The stove was beyond salvage, riddled with holes where rust had eaten through. But its presence suggested the cabin had been functional, once lived in, heated against cold that could kill if you weren't careful. The alcove showed signs of careful construction, the logs fitted with joints that had held for more than a century and a half. This hadn't been thrown together by someone hoping to survive one winter. This had been built by someone planning to stay. On the shelves, Margot found nothing but tin cups and the dried corpse of a mouse that had died seeking shelter in a place that offered none. The table's broken leg showed a clean break recent enough that the exposed wood hadn't weathered to match the rest. Margot lifted the table and found initials carved into the underside. A B 1867. Anna Blackwater. Great-great-grandmother who'd built this place with her own hands. Half Irish, half Ute, rejected by both worlds according to Margaret's letter, but strong enough to claim 40 acres and defend them against people who thought women couldn't own land, shouldn't own land, had no right to the kind of independence that came with property deeds and granite cliffs and silver hidden in mountain stone. Margot traced the carved letters and felt something shift in her chest. Connection across 5 generations. Blood calling to blood through time and survival, and the stubborn refusal to disappear just because the world wanted you gone. June had moved to the alcove again, and now stood very still, head tilted in that way that meant she'd noticed something important. "Mom, come here." Margot crossed the room in 3 steps. June was staring at the floor at a spot where her foot had disturbed the dust to reveal wood beneath. "This board moved when I stepped on it." Margot knelt and pressed her hand to the floorboard in question. It shifted under pressure, not much, but enough. The nails had been pulled and replaced often enough that the wood had lost its grip, that someone could remove it without tools if they knew where to push. She worked her fingers into the gap between boards and pulled. The board came up easily, too easily, lifted free to reveal more boards running perpendicular beneath, and wedged between them, partially visible, was a metal tin about the size of a shoebox. Margot's hands were steady as she freed it from its hiding place, though her heart hammered against ribs that suddenly felt too fragile to contain it. The tin was old but intact, sealed against moisture by a layer of wax that cracked as she pried the lid open with fingernails she'd kept short for 7 months of living in tight spaces. Inside, wrapped in wax paper that had protected them from time and damp, were 3 photographs and a handwritten note. The first photograph showed a woman standing in front of this cabin, perhaps 30 years old, with features that marked her as exactly what Margaret had described. Pale skin that spoke of Irish ancestry, but cheekbones and eyes that carried something else, something that would have made her unwelcome in both the Irish settlements and the Ute camps. She wore work clothes and held herself with the posture of someone who'd learned to claim space despite the world's resistance. On the back in faded ink, Anna Blackwater, 1867. The second showed the same woman, older now, maybe 60. She stood in the same spot but held something in her hands, something small and rectangular that the photograph's age had rendered too blurry to identify clearly. The third photograph made Margot's breath catch. Young Margaret, maybe 30 years old, standing in this cabin in this very room. She smiled at the camera with the same determination Anna had shown a century earlier. On the back, Margaret Whitmore, 1974. The note was written in Anna's hand, the paper fragile enough that Margot handled it like prayer. "For daughters of my blood who come after, look beneath where I rest my head. The mountain keeps promises." Margot read it twice, then a third time. June leaned close enough that her hair brushed Margot's cheek, both of them studying the photographs with the focused intensity of people trying to decode a language they'd never learned but somehow understood. "She looks like us." June touched Anna's image with one careful finger, avoiding the fragile surface of the photograph itself. Same eyes. Margot saw it too, couldn't unsee it now that June had pointed it out. The shape of June's face echoed in Anna's bones. The set of Margot's jaw mirrored in how Anna held her head, that particular angle of defiance, mixed with exhaustion that came from fighting battles that never quite ended. 5 generations in the blood still carried forward, visible and undeniable in sepia tones and careful poses. "Beneath where I rest my head." Margot looked toward the alcove, the sleeping area where Anna would have laid her head for 51 years. Northeast corner, Margaret's letter had said. They moved together, mother and daughter, to the alcove's far corner where dust lay thicker than anywhere else in the cabin. Margot examined the floorboards with new attention. One board slightly different from the others, newer wood, or at least more recently placed. She pressed down and felt it give, felt it shift in ways that suggested frequent use over many years. This one. She pulled and the board came free. Beneath it, two more boards. She removed those and revealed what lay underneath, what Anna had hidden and Margaret had protected, and now passed to Margot as inheritance and burden and test. A wooden hatch, 3 feet square, fitted so perfectly into the subfloor that it had been invisible until exposed. An iron ring handle set into the wood, and beside it, built into the hatch itself, a combination lock. 3 rotating dials, numbers 0 through 9 on each. June's voice came out barely above a whisper. The trapdoor. Margot pulled Margaret's letter from her pocket with shaking hands, though she'd memorized the numbers days ago. 1867. The year Anna built her home, the year she staked her claim to 40 acres and dared anyone to take them from her. She set the first dial. 1, then 8, 6, 7. Her fingers found the iron ring and pulled. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the small cabin, bouncing off walls that had heard this sound before, that had witnessed Margaret opening this hatch, and her mother before her, and Anna herself, climbing up and down for decades. Margot lifted the hatch, slowly fighting hinges that groaned after years without movement. Cool air rushed up from below, carrying the smell of deep earth and minerals and something else. Something that suggested vast spaces hidden beneath their feet, caverns and passages that extended into the mountain like veins carrying secrets through stone. Margot pulled the heavy-duty flashlight from her backpack and aimed it into the darkness below. The beam revealed wooden ladder rungs descending into shadow, worn smooth by hands that had climbed up and down for years. She could see the first 10 or 12 rungs, each one polished by use. Beyond that, the light couldn't penetrate, swallowed by darkness that seemed to have depth and texture and weight. "What's down there?" June's voice carried equal parts excitement and fear, the particular mix that comes from standing at the edge of something that might be wonderful or terrible or both. "I don't know. But Grandma knew, and Anna knew before her." "Are we going down?" Margot looked at the ladder, at the darkness, at her 9-year-old daughter, whose life had already asked too much courage from her. "Not yet. First we make sure it's safe. We need more supplies." The drive to Copperfield took 40 minutes on roads that deteriorated from paved to dirt to barely there tracks that required constant attention. The town appeared suddenly tucked into a valley between mountains that looked like they were leaning in to whisper secrets. The population sign promised 412 residents, though Margot suspected that number included people who'd moved away decades ago, and nobody had bothered to update the count. One main street, a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1985. A diner with 3 pickup trucks parked outside, condensation on the windows suggesting warmth and coffee and normalcy Margot hadn't experienced in 7 months. And at the end of the street, a 2-story building with a hand-painted sign, Ruth's General Store, established 1956. Margot parked and felt June's hand slip into hers as they crossed the street. The bell over the door chimed as they entered, announcing their presence to whoever might care that strangers had arrived. The interior smelled of coffee and old wood, and something baking in back yeast and sugar combining in ways that made Margot's stomach clench with hunger she'd been ignoring. Shelves packed with everything from canned goods to fishing tackle to what appeared to be veterinary supplies. A place that served a community too far from civilization to afford specialization, where one store had to stock everything because the next option was 70 miles away. The woman behind the counter looked up from a crossword puzzle and studied Margot with eyes that had spent 7 decades reading people, cataloging their stories in the way their shoulders sat, how their clothes fit, whether they met your gaze or looked away. White hair pulled back in a bun, face weathered by mountain sun, and wind hands that moved with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime stocking shelves and making change and knowing everyone's business, because in a town of 400 people, privacy was a luxury nobody could afford. Help you. I need supplies. Flashlights, rope camping gear. The woman came around the counter with surprising agility for someone who had to be at least 70. She moved toward the back shelves with purpose, each step taking her exactly where she needed to go. Camping up in the mountains, getting late in the season, weather can turn quick this high up. Just for a day or two, nothing extensive. The woman gathered items as Margot listed them. 2 more heavy-duty flashlights with batteries that promised 12 hours of continuous use. Waterproof matches, emergency blankets that folded down to the size of playing cards, a first aid kit that looked military surplus comprehensive enough to handle real injuries rather than just scraped knees. You're not from around here. No, but your grandmother owned property nearby. The shift in questioning was subtle but deliberate, moving from casual conversation to something more pointed. My grandmother was Margaret Whitmore. The crossword puzzle forgotten. The woman stopped moving and turned to face Margot directly, assessment sharpening into something that looked like recognition mixed with relief. Margaret Whitmore. Well, I'll be damned. She extended a hand that was dry and strong calluses earned through decades of work. Martha Brennan. I run this place. Knew your grandmother 40 years, maybe more. Heard she passed. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. Martha rang up the supplies with practiced efficiency, but her attention stayed on Margot's face, reading things that probably showed more clearly than Margot intended. Margaret used to come through here every few months, regular as clockwork. She'd buy supplies and head up to that mountain property of hers. Do you know what she was doing up there? Martha leaned against the counter, studying Margot with an intensity that felt like assessment. Never asked. Figured it wasn't my business. But I'll tell you what I noticed. She bought specific things. Survey equipment sometimes. Rock hammers. Those heavy lanterns that miners use. And she'd stay up there for weeks alone. Margot felt her pulse quicken despite her best efforts to stay calm. Did anyone ever go with her? Not that I saw. Always solo. Martha paused, then made a decision visible in the way her posture shifted. You know, there's a geologist lives in town. Retired professor from Colorado School of Mines. Dr. Caroline Hayes. Blue house on Maple 2 blocks north. Margaret used to bring her rock samples sometimes. Why are you telling me this? Martha's smile carried knowledge earned through decades of watching people come and go, of understanding when to speak and when to stay silent. Because Margaret was private about what she was doing, but she wasn't secretive with people she trusted. And if you're here asking about supplies for that property, you're probably about to need someone who understands rocks. The blue house on Maple stood behind a garden that looked like a geological museum had exploded across the lawn. Specimens arranged on low walls labeled rock formations, creating borders that most people would use for flowers. Even the stepping stones were chosen for their fossil content, ancient shells pressed into limestone like memories the earth refused to let go. Margot knocked and waited June beside her, both of them dusty from the cabin and uncertain about involving anyone else in whatever Margaret had left them. The woman who opened the door was tall and slightly stooped, white hair, wild around a face that suggested decades spent outdoors studying things most people walked past without seeing. Thick glasses magnified blue eyes that fastened on Margot with immediate focus. Yes, Dr. Hayes, Martha Brennan suggested I talk to you. I'm Margot Whitmore, Margaret Whitmore's granddaughter. The change was immediate. Caroline Hayes straightened, glasses slipping down her nose as recognition hit like voltage through wire. Whitmore. Margaret Whitmore's granddaughter. Come in. Please come in. The house's interior had been converted to a workspace that would make any geologist weep with envy or jealousy or both. Shelves lined every wall, packed with labeled specimens that represented decades of field work. A massive desk held microscopes and testing equipment that looked expensive enough to require insurance. Geological maps covered available wall space. Colorado's underground rendered in careful detail that showed where mountains held their treasures and where they kept their secrets. Caroline cleared papers from two chairs with movements that suggested she didn't often have visitors, didn't often need to make space for other humans in this world of stone and analysis. Sit, please. She gestured for Margot and June to settle, then opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled in neat script, Whitmore, Confidential. Margaret came to me 15 years ago, brought rock samples, asked me to analyze them quietly. Caroline opened the folder, revealing photographs and typed reports that had the weight of official documentation, the kind of paperwork that could be submitted to insurance companies or government agencies, or anyone who needed proof that what they were looking at was real. I'm a geologist. Spent 45 years studying Colorado mineral deposits. Retired now, but Margaret knew I wouldn't talk, knew I could be trusted with secrets that needed keeping. What did you find? Caroline spread photographs across the desk. Close-ups of rock samples the stone shot through with gleaming veins that caught light like captured stars, like someone had poured liquid silver through granite and let it solidify in patterns that defied natural formation. Wire silver, museum-quality specimens. The formation is exceptional. Purity, remarkable. She watched Margot's face, gauging reaction, waiting to see if the words landed the way they should. Conservative estimate for just the samples Margaret brought me, $4 to $6 million. The room tilted. Margot gripped the chair arms and tried to process numbers that didn't fit in any mental category she had available, that existed in a realm so far removed from $17.50 per day that they might as well have been discussing the value of stars or oceans or other things too vast to quantify. Caroline wasn't finished. But that's just samples. If there's a vein, an actual producing vein of this quality, we're talking $18 to $25 million, maybe more depending on the extent and accessibility. June made a sound, half gasp, half whimper. Margot pulled her close and tried to breathe through the shock, through the sudden understanding that Margaret's $5 inheritance had been deliberate cruelty from Sterling and Sloane's perspective, but something else entirely from Margaret herself. Why didn't Grandma mine it? Caroline's expression softened into something that looked like respect mixed with sorrow. She said it wasn't about the money, mentioned indigenous heritage, sacred sites, a promise someone had made a long time ago. She was negotiating some kind of agreement. Said when the time was right, someone in her family would honor it properly. The older woman leaned forward, studying Margot with the same intensity she probably used on geological formations, looking for fracture lines and points of stress. I'm guessing that someone is you. I don't know yet. I don't even know if what she left me contains any of this. Caroline stood and began gathering equipment with the decisive movements of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for 15 years. I'd like to visit the site, do a proper assessment, but I need to be clear about something first. I'm in my mid-70s. I have more money than I need and more years behind me than ahead. I'm not interested in exploiting your discovery or making claims I haven't earned. She met Margot's eyes directly. I just want to see a genuine find one more time before I die. Would that be acceptable? Margot felt the weight of decision pressing down. Involving someone else meant risk, meant trusting, meant exposing whatever lay under that cabin to another person's knowledge and judgment and potential greed. But it also meant expertise confirmation, someone who could tell her if the dreams Margaret had planted were real, or just the confused hopes of a dying woman trying to make meaning from a worthless inheritance. Yes. Thank you. Caroline nodded and continued packing, methodical in the way of people who'd spent careers preparing for field work. Your brother is threatening to contest the will. Martha mentioned you got a text about filing Monday. The words landed like ice water. Margot hadn't told Martha about Sterling's text, which meant small-town networks operated faster than cell signals, information passing through conversations and observations in ways that technology couldn't match. Hearing scheduled for March 9th, 9 a.m. Then you need a lawyer. There's an attorney here. Nathan Aldridge. He handles mineral rights cases. I'll call him. I don't have money for a lawyer. Caroline picked up her phone with fingers that didn't shake despite their age. Let me talk to Nathan. He's a good man. He'll work something out. They were loading equipment into Caroline's battered pickup when Margot heard the sound that made her stomach drop like stone down a well. A vehicle engine approaching fast on the dirt road, the particular growl of expensive machinery pushing harder than the terrain warranted. She turned and felt her stomach drop. Sterling's Tesla Model X appeared through the trees, white paint catching afternoon light in ways that seemed designed to announce wealth and power and the absolute certainty of people who'd never learned to doubt their right to any space they occupied. He pulled up beside the Honda with aggressive confidence, parking too close, making it clear this was his investigation, his property dispute, his right to be here regardless of what anyone said. The driver's door opened, and Sterling stepped out, phone pressed to his ear, as always living his life through a screen, even when standing in mountain clearings, investigating grandmother's estates. He ended the call and surveyed Margot, June, and Caroline with the assessment of a CEO evaluating a failing division. Margot. Finally. You don't answer your phone. The lie came easily practiced through 7 months of avoiding people she couldn't afford to talk to. No signal up at the cabin. Sloan and I hired an investigator. GPS tracker on your car. He gestured to the Honda like he was pointing out evidence in a trial. Seemed wise given your tendency toward poor decisions. Margot's hands clenched into fists, nails cutting crescents into palms. You're tracking me. Protecting family interests. A second man emerged from the passenger seat, camera equipment in hand. Trevor Harris, property assessor, here to document the cabin's condition for Sterling and Sloan's lawsuit. He was already raising his camera, photographing the Honda, the supplies Caroline's truck, building a visual case that Margot was unstable, irresponsible, incapable of managing property worth millions that she didn't even know existed. You don't have permission to assess anything. That property is mine. Actually, the will is in probate for 90 days, during which Sloan and I have the right to contest any distributions we believe are unfair or resulted from diminished capacity or undue influence. Sterling stepped between Margot and Trevor, making it clear this was his show, his investigation, his right to be here. Trevor will be documenting the cabin's condition for our lawsuit. This is trespassing. This is family property under dispute. We have every right to document its condition and ensure it's being managed responsibly. A second vehicle appeared. Sloan's Maserati, absurdly out of place on the dirt road, pulling up behind Sterling's Tesla like a convoy of wealth come to claim what they'd decided belonged to them. She emerged in clothes that cost more than Margot made in a month, looking around Copperfield with visible distaste, making it clear what she thought of small towns and their general stores and people who chose to live in places where success couldn't be measured in billable hours or corner offices. So this is where Margaret's dementia led her. A mountain shack in the middle of nowhere. She walked toward Margot with controlled aggression, the particular gait of lawyers who'd won too many battles to expect defeat. Now, Margot, let's be adults about this. You're homeless, living in your car with June. Ryan's very concerned about her welfare. The world narrowed to pinpoint focus. Margot heard her voice come out level despite the rage flooding her system, despite the way her vision was contracting to tunnel vision that included only Sloan's face. You've been talking to my ex-husband about me. Someone has to think about June's best interests. Sloan pulled a folder from her briefcase with movements that suggested this had been prepared in advance. rehearsed, weaponized. We have documentation, photographs of you living in your vehicle, statements from Ryan about the unstable living situation. A judge would be very interested in reviewing custody arrangements given current circumstances. Sterling moved closer, tag-teaming with coordination that spoke of planning of strategy sessions where they'd mapped out exactly how to pressure Margot into surrendering property she didn't even fully understand yet. We're prepared to petition for emergency custody review. If you won't be reasonable about the property, we'll have no choice. The threat landed like physical violence. Margot felt June press against her side, small and afraid, understanding enough to know her mother was being threatened in ways that involved her, that she was being used as leverage in a game adults were playing with her childhood. Sign over the property. Take $100,000 cash. We'll drop all custody concerns and you can get an apartment. Get stable. Provide June with what she needs. Sloane's voice carried surgical precision, each word placed for maximum impact. Or refuse, and we'll destroy you in court. For the property and for June. You can't afford that fight, Margot. We can. Caroline stepped forward, inserting herself between Margot and her siblings with the physical presence of someone who'd spent decades in mountain terrain and wasn't intimidated by expensive suits or legal threats. I don't believe we've met. Dr. Caroline Hayes, retired geologist. She extended her hand with enough force that Sterling had to either shake it or commit to obvious rudeness. I've been consulting on the property in question. It's quite fascinating from a geological perspective. Sloane's eyes narrowed into the particular expression lawyers get when unexpected variables enter carefully planned scenarios. Consulting on what basis? On the basis that Margot asked me to, which she has every right to do as the legal owner. The property's value is being contested. Sloane shifted into lawyer mode voice, taking on the tone she probably used in depositions. Any assessments or consultations conducted before the hearing are premature and potentially fraudulent. Caroline smiled with the patience of someone who'd dealt with aggressive people trying to claim expertise they didn't possess. I'm not assessing value for sale. I'm providing scientific analysis of geological formations. Perfectly legal, and none of your concern until and unless a court says otherwise. Trevor finished photographing and moved back towards Sterling, equipment in hand. Got everything I need. Sterling turned back to Margot, his expression shifting into something that might have been genuine concern if she hadn't known him for 37 years, hadn't watched him perform empathy without ever quite feeling it. We'll see you in court next Monday, 9 a.m. sharp. Last chance to avoid this becoming ugly. $100,000. Take it and walk away while you still can. Margot looked at her brother, at her sister, at the people who should have been her safety net when Ryan left, when the money ran out, when the car became their home. People who'd laughed at her inheritance and were now desperate to take it from her, willing to weaponize her daughter to get at 40 acres of mountain property that might contain nothing more valuable than the $5 Margaret had left in cash. Get off my property. Her voice didn't shake despite everything. Despite the fear and rage and 7 months of accumulated exhaustion. You have 10 seconds before I call the sheriff. There's no cell service here. Sterling's smile was patronizing, the expression of someone who thought he'd won. Then I guess we'll see how long you want to stand here arguing about trespassing on land that won't be yours much longer. Trevor was already in the Tesla. Sterling held Margot's stare for a long moment, looking for weakness, for the break that would let him push harder, that would give him the leverage he needed. He didn't find it. Next Monday, 9 a.m. Hope you've made arrangements for June's care when this goes badly for you. They left in a convoy of expensive vehicles, kicking up dust that hung in the air long after the engine sounds faded. Particulate matter settling slowly like fallout from an explosion that had left no visible wounds but had damaged something fundamental underneath. Margot stood in the settling silence, arms still around June, trying to stop shaking, trying to process the threat that had been delivered with lawyer precision and brother certainty. Caroline touched her shoulder with a grip that was surprisingly strong despite her age. "You need to find what's under that cabin now, before they come back with a court order Monday morning." The drive back took 30 minutes through mountain passes that held shadows longer than seemed natural for afternoon sun. Margot's mind raced through implications and possibilities, and the cold reality that Sterling and Sloane would use June as a weapon if it meant winning, would paint her homelessness as neglect, would take her daughter to get at property that might contain 30 million in silver, or might contain nothing but Anna Blackwater's broken dreams. Caroline followed in her truck equipment, rattling in the bed like bones in a box. When they reached the cabin, the older woman moved with purpose that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment, not just for 15 years, but for her entire career, that this was why she'd spent 4 decades studying Colorado geology, so she could be here for this discovery. "Show me." Margot led her inside to the alcove, to the open trapdoor that revealed wooden ladder rungs descending into darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "This goes deep, at least 30 feet, possibly more." Caroline knelt at the edge and shined her flashlight into the depths, the beam revealing the ladder descending, and then nothing swallowed by shadow that had texture and weight. "You've been down." "Not yet." Caroline stood and began unpacking climbing gear from her bag with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in caves and mines and geological formations that required more than just courage. "Then let's see what Anna Blackwater was protecting." Margot secured the rope around a roof beam that looked solid enough to hold weight, testing it twice before trusting their lives to wood that had held the cabin upright for a century and a half. She tested the first ladder rung. It held. The second. The third. Each step required faith that 159-year-old wood wouldn't snap and send her plummeting into whatever waited below. "I'll go first. You wait here." June shook her head with the determination that had gotten her through 7 months of sleeping in cars and pretending everything was fine. "We go together, Mom. We're a team. Remember?" Margot looked at her daughter and saw herself reflected back, stubborn and brave and refusing to be left behind when important things were happening, when the story of their lives was being written in real time. She clipped a flashlight to June's belt and adjusted the straps on the child-sized climbing harness Caroline had produced from supplies that suggested she'd been prepared for exactly this scenario. Slowly. Test every rung. If anything feels wrong, we come back up immediately. Okay. The descent took forever. Margot counted rungs to keep herself focused, to prevent her mind from spinning scenarios where the ladder broke, where they fell into darkness, where June got hurt, because Margot had brought her daughter into a mine that should have stayed sealed. 10 rungs, 20, 30. The air grew colder with each step, the smell of minerals intensifying until it coated the back of her throat. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, each drop echoing like a heartbeat. At 35 rungs, her feet touched solid stone. She unclipped from the safety line and helped June down the last few steps, both of them standing together in a space that felt vast despite the darkness pressing close from all sides. Margot swept her flashlight in a slow arc and felt her breath catch. They were standing in a tunnel, hand-carved from granite maybe 7 feet high and 5 feet wide. Timber beams supported the ceiling at regular intervals, installed with the care of someone who understood that mountains could kill you if you didn't respect them. That rock was patient and would wait centuries for the chance to reclaim space humans had stolen. The floor had been worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, the stone polished by Anna's boots, walking the same path over and over until the rock itself remembered her passage. "This isn't a natural cave," Margot's voice echoed strangely, bouncing off walls in ways that made the space sound both smaller and larger than it was. "This is a mine," she called up to Caroline, her voice carrying through 35 feet of open air. "We're in a tunnel. Looks hand-carved. Very old." Caroline's response drifted down, voice distorted by distance and stone. "Follow it carefully. Look for ore deposits. Any samples you can bring up will help with assessment." June walked beside Margot as they moved deeper into the tunnel, their flashlight beams cutting through darkness that felt almost solid. 50 feet, 70. The passage ran straight, then opened into a larger chamber where the mining work became obvious, impossible to mistake for anything else. Pick marks scored the walls in patterns that suggested systematic extraction, someone working methodically to remove stone and separate valuable ore from worthless rock. Against one wall, wooden crates stood stacked in careful rows, organized with the precision of someone who planned to return, who expected to need what they'd stored here. Margot approached the first crate and pried the lid free with fingernails that had been kept short for practical reasons, for living in tight spaces where long nails caught on everything. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and time, were chunks of rock shot through with veins that gleamed in the flashlight beam. Even with no geological knowledge, even with no training in mineralogy or mining or any of the sciences that would let her identify what she was looking at with certainty, Margot could see these were different from ordinary stone. The veins had structure, crystalline formation, the kind of beauty that suggested value beyond aesthetic appreciation. "Is this silver?" June touched one piece carefully, reverently, like it might crumble under too much pressure. "It's pretty." The second crate held mining tools, pickaxes and chisels and hammers, all hand-forged, all showing the wear of extensive use. One pickaxe handle had initials carved into the wood letters that had been traced and retraced until they were deep enough to last forever. A B. Anna was here, working this mine. For how long? The third crate was smaller, constructed with more care than the others, sealed against moisture with multiple layers of wax that suggested the contents mattered more than tools or ore samples. Inside, protected by oiled cloth that cracked when touched, was a leather-bound journal. Margot lifted it out with hands that trembled despite her efforts at control. The leather had cracked with age but remained intact, held together by stitching that had been done with thread strong enough to outlast the person who'd sewn it. She opened to the first page and read by flashlight, Caroline's voice in her head about proper documentation and chain of evidence, but unable to stop herself from reading words that Anna Blackwater had written 159 years ago. Journal of Anna Blackwater, March 1867. The entries were detailed, written in careful script that suggested education, that spoke of someone who'd learned to read and write, despite being half Irish and half Ute, in a world that didn't value either heritage, that would have preferred she disappear entirely rather than claim space and property, and the kind of independence that came with owning 40 acres outright. Anna described her arrival in Colorado, her claim on the land, her discovery of the silver vein. The writing was matter-of-fact about hardships, clinical about mining techniques, documenting her work with the precision of someone who understood that records mattered, that proof of ownership and labor created legal protection against people who would take what she'd built. March 15, 1867. I've claimed this land today, $1.25 per acre. Paid in gold I panned from the creek. The claims office didn't want to process it. A half-breed woman owning property. But law is law. This is mine. Margot read, and June leaned close, following along, both of them traveling back through time to meet the woman whose blood they carried, whose stubbornness and strength had been passed down through 5 generations, like genetic inheritance. April 3rd, 1867. Built the cabin with my own hands. Men from town came to watch, to mock a woman doing man's work, they said. Let them mock. By winter I'll have walls. They'll still be drunk in Silverton saloons. May 18th, 1867. Found the vein today, not gold. Silver. Wire silver, the assayer said. Rare formation worth more than gold to the right buyers. I'll tell no one. A mixed-blood woman with a silver mine. They'd kill me for it. The entries continued through summer, Anna learning to extract ore, safely processing it in ways that kept the discovery hidden, that prevented word from spreading to the men who would have murdered her for this claim, who would have said a woman couldn't own property anyway, that mixed-blood people had no rights, the law was bound to respect. Then in August, the tone changed. The entries shifted from practical documentation to something else, something that felt like confession or testimony, or the beginning of a promise that would outlast everyone involved. August 12th, 1867. Met today with an elder of the Ute people. His name is Running Wolf. He knew I was here, knew about my mining. I expected anger. Instead, he showed me kindness. Margot's hands shook as she turned the page. He took me deeper into the mountain, showed me sacred chambers where his people performed ceremonies, places where young men came to become warriors, where ancestors left offerings. I felt ashamed standing there with my pickaxe and my greed. Running Wolf doesn't condemn my mining, says the earth gives what it gives, but he asked me to make a promise. If I profit from this silver, I'll protect what his people left, return it someday when the time is right. I gave my word. It's the least I can do. The journal continued with entries about learning from Running Wolf, about finding connection with someone who understood being between worlds, about hiding the sacred objects Anna had been shown, protecting them until the time was right for their return. At the back of the journal, tucked into a pocket in the binding, Margot found a hand-drawn map. It showed this chamber marked as first chamber, main cache. 3 additional tunnels branched off in different directions, each one labeled in Anna's careful script. East ore vein, west water source, north sacred place. A note at the bottom read, "The covenant is in the sacred place. Honor it or lose everything." Mom. June's voice was small, carrying the weight of understanding that was too heavy for 9 years old. What's a covenant? A promise. A serious one. Anna promised Running Wolf she'd protect the sacred things his people left here. She kept that promise her whole life, and Grandma Margaret kept it after her. Now it's ours to keep, even if it means we don't get the silver. Margot looked at her daughter and saw the question underneath the question, the fear that had been living in June's eyes for 7 months. Even if it means we stay homeless, even if it means we lose to Sterling and Sloan, even if it means we have nothing. The answer came without hesitation, rising from some place deeper than practical concerns about shelter and food, and the $17.50 per day that stood between them and complete destitution. Even then, some promises matter more than money. From somewhere deep in the tunnels came a sound, faint but distinct, like footsteps on stone or falling rock, or the settling of ancient timbers straining under mountain weight that had been pressing down for centuries. June pressed closer, her hand finding Margot's in the darkness. What was that? Probably nothing. Old minds make noise as they settle. But Margot's hand found the rope and held tight, and both of them stared into the darkness beyond their flashlight beams, wondering what else Anna had hidden in the mountain, and whether they were truly alone down here in chambers that had kept secrets for 5 generations, waiting for the right person to understand what those secrets meant and what they would cost to honor properly.